They were told Americans would torture them, leave them to die in pain, treat them like animals. But when 47 Japanese women stepped off the hospital ship in San Francisco Bay, August 1945, the enemy broke them not with cruelty but with antibiotics and clean bandages. They expected screaming and beatings. Instead, they heard soft voices asking where it hurt. For women who had spent months with infected wounds and broken bones, who had been taught that capture meant a fate worse than death, this kindness would prove more difficult to accept than any torture. If you're interested in untold stories from World War II, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more incredible true accounts of history. The war in the Pacific had ended just weeks earlier. Emperor Hirohito's voice had crackled across radios throughout Japan, announcing surrender in words most citizens had never imagined hearing. For the women of the Women's Volunteer Corps and military nurses who had served on remote islands, the announcement came not as relief but as terror. Keiko was 23 years old, a trained nurse who had worked in a field hospital on Okinawa. She had watched American bombs tear through buildings, had pulled shrapnel from screaming soldiers, had held dying men as they called for their mothers. When the surrender came, she and 46 other women were gathered by American soldiers. Their hands were bound. Not tightly, not cruelly, just secured. But the message was clear. They were prisoners now. The journey began on a transport ship. The women were kept in a cargo hold, separated from male prisoners. The air was thick with the smell of salt water, diesel fuel, and fear. Most of the women had injuries. Keiko's left arm had been broken during a bombing raid 3 months earlier. It had never been properly set. The bone had healed crooked, and constant pain shot through her elbow whenever she moved. Yuki, at just 19, had burns covering her right shoulder and neck from a fire. The skin had scarred badly, pulling tight whenever she turned her head. Sachiko, 26, walked with a pronounced limp from an untreated leg wound that had become infected. The infection had never fully healed, and green-yellow discharge still seeped through her torn uniform. They whispered to each other in the darkness of the hold. What would the Americans do to them? They had all heard the propaganda. American soldiers were monsters who showed no mercy to prisoners, especially women. They would be humiliated, beaten, perhaps worse. Death might be a mercy. After days at sea, the ship entered San Francisco Bay. The women were brought up on deck, blinking in the bright August sunlight. The first thing that hit them was the smell. Not the smell of death and destruction they had grown used to, but the smell of a living city. Bread baking somewhere in the distance, car exhaust, fresh paint. The Golden Gate Bridge rose in the distance, rust red against a clear blue sky. The city beyond was intact. No bombed-out buildings, no rubble in the streets. Everything was whole, functioning, alive. The contrast was stunning. Japan was broken. Its cities were ash and ruins. Food was scarce. Medicine was almost impossible to find. But here the enemy's homeland stood untouched, prosperous, impossibly clean. They were loaded onto trucks. American soldiers, young men not much different in age from Japanese soldiers, handled them carefully. No shoving, no angry words. Just firm directions in English they barely understood. The trucks drove through city streets. The women pressed against the canvas sides, stealing glimpses of American life. Children played on sidewalks. Women pushed baby carriages. Shops displayed goods in windows. Normal life as if there had never been a war. The truck stopped at Letterman Army Hospital, a sprawling complex of white buildings overlooking the bay. The women were helped down from the trucks. Helped, not dragged. American nurses waited at the entrance. They wore crisp white uniforms with red crosses on their caps. Their faces were neutral, professional. No hatred, no anger. Just the practiced calm of medical professionals. Keiko's heart hammered in her chest. This was it. Whatever was going to happen would happen here. She glanced at Yuki beside her. The younger woman's face was pale, her burned shoulder hunched protectively. Sachiko stood on her other side, weight shifted off her infected leg, jaw set with determination to show no weakness. Medical evaluation, one of the American officers said through a translator. The translator was a Japanese-American man, middle-aged, his face kind but tired. You will be examined by doctors. Your injuries will be treated. The words made no sense. Treated? Why would the enemy treat their injuries? This had to be some kind of trick. Perhaps they would be examined only to be used for medical experiments. Stories of such things had circulated during the war, whispered rumors of terrible things done to prisoners. They were led inside, one by one, into examination rooms. Keiko went first, steeling herself for pain. A doctor entered. He was older, perhaps 50, with gray hair at his temples and glasses perched on his nose. A nurse stood beside him, a young blonde woman with a gentle face. The doctor gestured to Keiko's arm. Through the translator, he asked, "May I look at this?" May I?" He was asking permission. Slowly, Keiko extended her crooked arm. The doctor's hands were gentle as he examined it, his touch careful. He frowned, shaking his head. "This should have been set properly months ago," he said. "It must be very painful." Keiko said nothing. Her throat was tight. The doctor continued his examination, checking her ribs, her legs, looking into her eyes and ears. Then he stepped back and spoke to the translator. The translator turned to Keiko. The doctor says your arm needs to be rebroken and set correctly. It will be painful, but it will heal properly. He also says you are malnourished and have signs of chronic fatigue. You will be given food, vitamins, and rest. All treatment will be provided at no cost to you. At no cost. The words echoed in Keiko's mind. In Japan, medical care had become a luxury. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Supplies were nearly gone. Doctors treated those who could pay, or those the military deemed essential. Common people suffered and died without care. And here was the enemy, offering free medical treatment to their prisoners. One by one, each woman was examined. Yuki's burns were carefully cleaned and treated with a white ointment that the nurse explained would help prevent infection and reduce scarring. The nurse worked slowly, her touch feather-light on the damaged skin. Yuki's eyes filled with tears, not from pain, but from the unexpected gentleness. Sachiko's infected leg wound was examined by a surgeon. He looked grave as he inspected it, then explained through the translator that the infection was serious. It needed to be cleaned surgically, then treated with a new medicine called penicillin. Without treatment, Sachiko might lose the leg. With treatment, it would heal completely. The women were given hospital gowns and shown to a ward. It was clean, blindingly clean. White sheets on the beds, sunlight streaming through windows that actually had glass in them. Vases with fresh flowers sat on a table in the center of the room. Flowers. For prisoners. That first night, Keiko lay in a real bed with clean sheets and a pillow that smelled of soap. Her arm throbbed. Tomorrow they would re-break it and set it properly. The thought terrified her. But the doctor had been kind. The nurse had been gentle. Nothing made sense. The next morning, nurses brought breakfast. Real food. Not much, as their stomachs couldn't handle large meals yet, but real food. Soft boiled eggs, toast with butter, orange juice, tea with sugar and milk. The women stared at the trays. Keiko picked up a piece of toast. The butter melted into it, golden and rich. She took a bite. The taste exploded on her tongue. Real wheat bread, not the sawdust and rice husk mixture they had eaten for years. She closed her eyes and for a moment forgot where she was. Then the surgeries began. Keiko was taken to an operating room. The doctor explained everything through the translator. They would give her anesthesia. She would fall asleep and feel nothing. When she woke, her arm would be straight and properly splinted. It would hurt for a while, but it would heal correctly. She lay on the operating table, staring at the bright lights above. A nurse held her good hand. Another placed a mask over her face. The doctor said something in English, his voice calm and reassuring, even though she couldn't understand the words. She breathed in the sweet-smelling gas and darkness took her. When she woke, her arm was in a cast. White plaster from shoulder to wrist. It ached, a deep bone ache, but different from before. Already she could tell it was straighter. A nurse sat beside her bed, monitoring her. When Keiko's eyes opened, the nurse smiled and said something in English, then fetched the translator. The surgery went well, the translator said. The doctor says you will need to keep the cast on for 6 weeks. After that, your arm should function normally again. Sachiko's surgery took longer. The infection in her leg had to be cleaned out, dead tissue removed. The penicillin the doctors gave her was a miracle. Within 3 days, the fever that had plagued her for months was gone. The wound began to close. She cried when she realized she would keep her leg. Yuki's burns were dressed daily with the white ointment. The nurses showed her how to massage the scarred tissue gently to keep it from pulling too tight. They gave her a mirror one day, and she stared at her reflection. The burns were still there, but they looked different. Cleaner, less angry. The nurses said that with time and treatment, the scarring would fade significantly. Days passed. The women grew stronger. They were fed 3 meals a day. Not large meals because their bodies needed time to adjust, but nutritious food. Meat, vegetables, fresh fruit, milk. Their bodies began to change. Color returned to their cheeks. The constant exhaustion that had weighed on them began to lift. The hospital staff treated them with professional courtesy. Doctors made their rounds, checking injuries, adjusting treatments. Nurses changed bandages, administered medications, answered questions through translators. No one mocked them. No one hurt them. They were treated like any other patients. At night, the women whispered to each other. They talked about their families back in Japan. Were they alive? Were they starving? The contrast was unbearable. Here they were, the enemy's prisoners, being fed and healed. Back home, their mothers and fathers and siblings likely had nothing. "My little brother is only 12, Yuki whispered one night. "He must be so hungry. And here I ate chicken today. Real chicken." The guilt was crushing. They were alive and healing while Japan suffered. The contradiction gnawed at them day and night. But there was something else too. Something harder to name. A slow dawning realization that everything they had been taught might have been wrong. A routine developed. Mornings began with nurses checking vital signs. Temperatures were taken, blood pressure measured, wounds inspected. Then came breakfast. The women began to expect the food, to look forward to it, though the guilt never fully left. After breakfast, physical therapy for those who needed it. Keiko worked with a therapist to maintain flexibility in her fingers while her arm was casted. Sachiko learned exercises to strengthen her healing leg. Yuki practiced stretches to keep her scarred shoulder mobile. The therapists were patient and encouraging. They smiled when the women made progress. They never showed frustration when exercises were difficult or painful. This patience was foreign to the women. In Japan's wartime hospitals, there had been no time for such care. You survived or you didn't. There was no middle ground. Afternoons brought visits from doctors. They checked healing, adjusted medications, answered questions. Through translators, they explained medical concepts the women had never heard. They talked about vitamins and nutrition, about how the body healed, about the importance of rest. Some of the women had been nurses themselves. Keiko found herself having long conversations with the American doctors through the translator. She asked about the new antibiotics, about surgical techniques, about how American medicine had advanced during the war. The doctors answered willingly, even drawing diagrams to help explain. One doctor, a surgeon named Dr. Morrison, brought Keiko a medical textbook one day. Through the translator, he said she might find it interesting. The book was in English, so she couldn't read it, but she spent hours looking at the detailed anatomical drawings. The Red Cross facilitated letters home. The women were allowed to write to their families, though they knew the letters would be censored. Keiko wrote to her mother, "Dear mother, I am alive and well. I am being held in America, but I am safe. They are treating my arm. The food is adequate. I think of you and father every day. Please do not worry about me. Your daughter, Keiko." She couldn't tell her mother the truth. She couldn't write that she was eating better than she had in 5 years, that her arm was being healed by enemy doctors at no cost, that she slept in a clean bed with white sheets. The guilt of such comfort made her feel sick. Months passed before replies came. The letters that arrived told of devastation. Keiko's mother wrote of living in the ruins of their house, of eating grass and tree bark to survive, of neighbors who had died from starvation or disease, of children with distended bellies from malnutrition. Keiko read the letter and wept. That night she couldn't eat her dinner. She stared at the chicken and vegetables on her plate and thought of her mother eating grass. Yuki's family had been in Hiroshima. She received no reply to her letter. The hospital chaplain, a kind older man, sat with her when the news came that the entire city had been destroyed by a single bomb. He said nothing, just sat beside her as she cried, his presence a silent comfort. The contradiction was becoming unbearable. They were prisoners of war, yet they were being treated better than citizens in their own country. The enemy had devastated Japan, had killed hundreds of thousands, had dropped atomic bombs on cities. And yet here these same enemies were healing them, feeding them, treating them with dignity. Small moments of humanity accumulated. A nurse named Betty began teaching Yuki simple English phrases. "Hello? Thank you. How are you?" Yuki practiced diligently, finding comfort in the structure of learning. Betty brought her magazines sometimes, pointing to pictures and naming things in English. Dr. Morrison continued to bring Keiko medical books and journals. He seemed to recognize her intelligence and her interest in medicine. One day, through the translator, he asked if she had considered becoming a doctor before the war. Keiko admitted she had dreamed of it, but such opportunities were rare for women in Japan. "In America, women can be doctors," Dr. Morrison said. "It is not easy, but it is possible. Perhaps after the war you could study here." The suggestion was absurd. She was a prisoner, an enemy. How could she ever study in America? And yet the casual way he said it, as if it were a natural possibility, planted a seed in her mind. Sachiko became close with an older nurse named Helen. Helen had a son who was a soldier in the Pacific. She showed Sachiko a photograph one day. A young man in uniform, smiling at the camera. He looked so young. "He is in Japan now," Helen said through the translator. "Part of the occupation forces. I pray for him every night." The moment was strange and profound. Here was an American woman whose son was occupying Sachiko's country, and yet she was tenderly caring for Sachiko's wounds. The complexity of it was dizzying. One afternoon, the women were allowed outside for fresh air. They sat in a courtyard with flowers and benches. The sun was warm on their faces. In the distance, they could see the bay, boats moving across the water. It was peaceful, beautiful even. A group of off-duty nurses sat nearby, eating lunch and laughing. One of them noticed the Japanese women and came over. She held out a chocolate bar, offering it to Yuki with a smile. Yuki hesitated, then took it, bowing in thanks. The nurse bowed back, imitating the gesture clumsily but with good humor. These small moments of kindness were almost harder to bear than cruelty would have been. Cruelty they understood. Cruelty made sense. Kindness from the enemy did not. Late at night, when the ward was quiet, the women talked. They whispered in Japanese, words tumbling out in the darkness, trying to make sense of their experience. "We were told Americans were devils," Sachiko said one night. "That they would torture us and leave us to die. But they healed us. Why?" "Perhaps it is a trick," another woman suggested. "Perhaps they want us to trust them before—" "Before what?" Keiko asked. "It has been months. If they wanted to hurt us, they would have done it by now." Silence fell. The truth was becoming impossible to ignore. The Americans were not monsters. They were people. Doctors and nurses doing their jobs. Young soldiers missing their homes. Mothers worried about their sons. People. The propaganda they had been fed during the war was crumbling, but accepting that meant accepting that they had been lied to, that their own leaders had lied to them, that the sacrifices, the suffering, the deaths had all been based on lies. Yuki struggled the most. She was young, and the propaganda had shaped her entire understanding of the world. To question it meant questioning everything she thought she knew. "But they dropped the atomic bombs," she said. "They killed so many people, children, old people. How can we say they are not evil?" "Japan started the war," Keiko said quietly. "We attacked Pearl Harbor. We invaded China. We killed millions. Are we not also evil?" The words hung in the air like blasphemy, but once spoken, they could not be taken back. The women were not united in their transformation. Some clung to their old beliefs, insisting that the American kindness was manipulation. Others began to see things differently, but were afraid to say so out loud. A few, like Keiko, began to question everything they had been taught. Arguments broke out sometimes. One older woman, a former military administrator, insisted that accepting American help was a betrayal, that they should refuse treatment, refuse food, remain loyal to the emperor and to Japan. "Loyal to what?" Sachiko shot back during one heated exchange. "To a country that fed us lies while our families starved? The emperor told us to die for honor, but what honor is there in dying for nothing?" The room fell silent after that outburst. Such words were dangerous even now, even here. But they were also true. The nurses and doctors noticed the tensions. The translators reported whispered conversations, debates, sometimes tears. Dr. Morrison asked Keiko about it one day. "Is there conflict among you?" he asked gently. Keiko hesitated, then nodded. Through the translator, she tried to explain how they had been taught one thing and were now experiencing another, how the contradiction was tearing them apart inside, how guilt and gratitude warred with loyalty and shame. Dr. Morrison listened, his face thoughtful. When she finished, he said something that she would remember for the rest of her life. "Questioning what you were taught is not betrayal, it is growth. The hardest thing in the world is to admit that what you believed was wrong. But it is also the bravest thing." 6 months after their arrival, Keiko's cast came off. Dr. Morrison was there for the removal. The plaster was cut away carefully, revealing pale skin beneath. Keiko moved her arm slowly. It was stiff from months of immobilization, but it was straight. It bent properly at the elbow. The chronic pain that had plagued her for so long was gone. She flexed her fingers, made a fist, straightened her arm. It worked. It actually worked. Tears rolled down her cheeks. "Thank you," she said in halting English. "Thank you." Dr. Morrison smiled. Through the translator, he said, "I am glad I could help. You will need physical therapy to regain full strength, but the bone has healed well. You should have full function of your arm again." That night, Keiko lay awake thinking. Her arm had been broken in an American bombing raid, and now an American doctor had healed it. The symmetry was strange and profound. She thought about the war, about all the propaganda she had believed, about how she had been taught that Americans were inhuman monsters, about how she had been ready to die rather than be captured. And then she thought about Dr. Morrison bringing her medical books, about Betty teaching Yuki English, about Helen showing Sachiko photos of her son, about the nurses who changed their bandages gently and asked if they were in pain, about meals served 3 times a day, about medication given freely, about treatment provided without cost. The propaganda had been wrong, completely, utterly wrong. Americans were not monsters. They were people. Complex, flawed people, but people nonetheless. Capable of terrible violence, yes, but also capable of mercy, kindness, and compassion. And if the propaganda about Americans had been wrong, what else had been wrong? The justifications for the war, the promises of victory, the claims that Japan was destined to rule Asia? Everything she had believed was built on lies. The realization was devastating and liberating in equal measure. If the enemy values our lives, why did our own leaders not? Perhaps captivity revealed more truth than freedom ever did. Perhaps kindness cuts deeper than cruelty ever could. The turning point came on a spring morning, almost a year after their arrival. The war had been over for months. Japan was occupied but rebuilding. Letters from home began arriving more regularly, bringing news of slow recovery. The women gathered in the courtyard as they often did now. Their injuries had healed. Keiko's arm was strong again. Sachiko walked without a limp. Yuki's scars had faded to pale lines, and she could move her shoulder freely. They were healthy, well-fed, and facing an uncertain future. An announcement came that they would soon be repatriated to Japan. They would go home. The news should have brought joy, but instead it brought complicated emotions. Home meant reuniting with families, but it also meant leaving behind the security and care they had found in captivity. That evening, Dr. Morrison came to the ward to say goodbye to his patients. He shook each woman's hand, wishing them well through the translator. When he reached Keiko, he paused. "You have a gift for medicine," he said. "Do not let anyone tell you otherwise. If you ever have the opportunity to study, take it. The world needs good doctors." He handed her a package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a medical textbook, translated into Japanese, along with a letter of recommendation written in English. Keiko stared at it, overwhelmed. "Why?" she asked, struggling with the English word. Dr. Morrison understood. Through the translator, he said, "Because healing knows no borders. Because suffering is universal. Because you have the compassion and intelligence to help people, and that is more important than which country you were born in." Keiko bowed deeply, the Japanese gesture of profound gratitude. When she straightened, tears streamed down her face. That night, the women talked until dawn. They spoke honestly now, without the fear and defensiveness that had marked their earlier conversations. "We were taught to hate," Sachiko said. "But hate is easy. It requires nothing from us. This—" she gestured around the ward. "This required them to see us as human beings worth saving. That is much harder." "I do not know how to go back," Yuki admitted. "How do I return to Japan and pretend I do not know what I know now, that everything we were taught was wrong?" "We carry the truth," Keiko said quietly. "We tell our children. We build a different future. That is how we honor what happened here." The greatest weapon had not been bombs or bullets. It had been compassion. And compassion had done what violence never could. It had changed their hearts. The ship that would take them back to Japan arrived 2 weeks later. The women stood on the dock, their small bundles of possessions in hand. American sailors loaded cargo. The morning was foggy, the bay gray and quiet. Keiko looked back at the hospital on the hill. A year ago she had entered it as a prisoner, injured and terrified. Now she was leaving healed, both in body and in understanding. The irony was profound. She was afraid to go home, afraid of what she would find, afraid of how her family would look at her, healthy and well-fed while they had suffered, afraid of the silence she would have to keep about what she had learned. The other women felt the same. They had whispered about it in the ward. How do you return to a shattered country carrying the knowledge that your enemies were more merciful than your own leaders? How do you live with that truth? Japan was not what they remembered. The cities they returned to were still ruins. Reconstruction had barely begun. People were gaunt with hunger. Children played in rubble. The occupation forces were everywhere. American soldiers in jeeps, handing out food, managing order. Keiko found her mother living in a shanty built from scavenged materials. The older woman cried when she saw her daughter, touching her face as if to make sure she was real. She looked at Keiko's healthy body, her clear skin, her straight arm, and asked no questions. That night her mother prepared a small meal. Thin soup, a handful of rice. It was all she had. Keiko ate it gratefully, though it was nothing like the meals she had eaten in the hospital. She did not speak of the food in America. She could not. But over time, in quiet moments, the story came out. Her mother listened as Keiko described the American hospital, the doctors who had healed her arm, the nurses who had been kind, the food they had provided, the care they had given. Her mother was silent for a long time. Then she said, "Perhaps we were wrong about many things." It was the closest she would come to admitting that the war had been built on lies. Years passed. Japan rebuilt. The country transformed from a militaristic empire to a democracy. The transformation was not easy, but it happened. Keiko used Dr. Morrison's recommendation letter to gain entrance to a medical school. It was difficult. There were very few women in medicine, and many people doubted her. But she persevered. She became a doctor, specializing in orthopedics. She spent her career setting broken bones and helping people heal. She never forgot Dr. Morrison. She kept the textbook he gave her on a shelf in her office, a reminder of a crucial moment in her life. Sometimes she would take it down and flip through it, remembering. Yuki became a translator. She used the English Betty had taught her as a foundation, building on it until she was fluent. She worked to help Americans and Japanese understand each other, believing that communication was the key to preventing future wars. Sachiko became a teacher. She taught history, but not the propaganda version she had learned as a child. She taught her students to question, to think critically, to understand that the world was complex and that no country had a monopoly on truth or virtue. They stayed in touch, the three of them, writing letters and occasionally meeting. They spoke openly with each other about their experiences in the American hospital. They acknowledged how it had changed them, how it had shattered their worldview and forced them to rebuild their understanding of everything. To their children, they told the truth. They spoke of the war honestly, not glorifying it or hiding its horrors. They spoke of their captivity, of the fear they had felt, and of the unexpected kindness they had received. Keiko told her daughter about Dr. Morrison re-breaking her arm to set it properly, about the pain of the surgery and the relief when it healed straight, about the medical books he gave her and the recommendation letter that changed her life. Why did he do it? Her daughter asked. Why would an enemy help you? Keiko thought carefully before answering. Because good people exist everywhere. Because healing is more important than hatred. Because sometimes the most revolutionary act is to treat your enemy with dignity. The lesson stayed with her daughter and years later with her granddaughter. The truth they carried forward was simple but profound. Humanity can survive even the worst conflicts, and compassion is stronger than cruelty. And so the antibiotics became more than medicine. The clean bandages became more than medical supplies. They became proof that even in war, even between enemies, there can be mercy. For those 47 Japanese women, the care they received in an American hospital became a symbol of something larger. It showed them that propaganda lies, that the enemy is human, and that kindness can be more powerful than any weapon. The hardest part was not the injuries or the captivity. It was learning that everything they had been taught was wrong. It was accepting mercy from those they had been told to hate. It was carrying the truth back to a broken country and finding a way to live with it. As Keiko told her granddaughter many years later, near the end of her life, the Americans could have let us die. Our own leaders had told us death was preferable to capture, but the American doctors saw us as patients who needed care, not as enemies who deserved suffering. That choice, that simple choice to heal rather than harm, taught me more about humanity than any lesson I'd learned before or since. Kindness from an enemy is a terrible and beautiful thing. It destroys hate, but in its place grows something better. Understanding. And that is the story worth remembering. Not just the history of a war, but the human truth at its core. That even in the darkest times, people can choose compassion over cruelty, healing over harm, humanity over hatred. These stories, though buried in time, still speak to us today. They remind us that enemies are often just people caught on different sides of a conflict, and that mercy can change hearts in ways that violence never could. If you found this story meaningful and want to hear more incredible true accounts from World War II, make sure to hit that subscribe button and like this video. These are stories that need to be told, remembered, and passed on to future generations.